Okay, I'm recording. How are you, Jake?
I'm good. How are you today?
Good. So for today's video, we want to talk about the difference between a PSA 9 and a PSA 10. And I was thinking I'll just give the viewer a quick overview. PSA is one of the companies that grades cards and tells you sort of what condition they're in and puts them in a slab permanently. And so the highest grade is a 10 out of 10. Second highest is 9 out of 10. And I'm really curious about the actual difference between these things, both in terms of like, do the 9 and 10 cards look different, as well as like what is the price differential between them? Why is that the case? Because from my point of view, like I don't care that much. And I'm curious about the people who care, like why does it really matter to get a PSA 10? Can you tell that the condition is different? Is it a better longer term investment? Like maybe I'm being dumb and I should only be buying PSA 10s because the 9s aren't going to go up in value anytime soon. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to enlighten me about all these things today. Um,
Yeah,
but I guess to start off, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the actual practical differences in condition between like how PSA thinks about a 9 versus a 10?
sure. So you can actually go onto the PSA website and you can read the specific criteria that they look for. But the basic idea, and I would suggest to anyone who's sending cards and submitting cards, read through the specific criteria that they write on that PSA website. But the general idea, the categories that they're grading your card on, the surface. So are there scratches on the surface? The surfaces of the card, the front and the back. Generally, hollow scratches will take more points off than a non-hollow scratch. The deeper the scratch, the bigger the scratch. A lot of that also has to do with eye appeal, like where the scratch is, how bad the scratch looks. So some of it is that sort of subjective opinion. Um, and you're talking about um, the centering on the card. So is the card picture very centered? Are there even spacings on the card, edges on the card? Is it crooked? Those sorts of
And as
things.
far as I understand, that's
Uh,
something that's like out of your hands, right? Like you could be keeping your card in
yeah,
perfect
great point.
condition, but like it just wasn't printed right.
Yeah, so that's where you get these fresh out of uh, the pack. You can get these off-centered cards, and you can also have things called print lines, which are not, you didn't scratch the card, but they're these print lines in the picture on the card that are from the factory, and that they'll also take points off of that. So that's why it's so difficult to get a 10, even when you're opening sealed packs.
That's another reason why it feels so arbitrary to me. Is just like if I
Yeah,
care about a card looking nice and the condition being good, it's like it was kind of like out of your hands, right? If it had a print line or an off center or another error like that. But I
yeah,
guess people do care about that.
yeah, yeah. And then the what are the edges like is another one. So is there whitening on the edges when you look at the back of a card? Um, and I have a few examples right here. These are two
Yeah.
cards I'm going to send into PSA. So this one is you can see this guy is a uh, finalist World's Promo card from 2008, and this card, if you can see, it has a chance at a 10, a small chance at a 10, but it's probably going to be a 9, in part because the off centering on the front, which you might be able to pick up in the
You mean the
camera,
border, the yellow border on one side
the
is
yellow
wider than
border,
on the other side?
the yellow border. But on the back, like there's almost no whitening, and the centering's pretty good on the back, a little off, but it's really a perfect card. So this card, for example, when you're thinking of 10s versus 9s, this card almost certainly will get at least a 9. It's a beautiful card. There's a good chance that it will probably get the 9 instead of the 10 because of that centering issue. There are no scratches on the card. Beautiful card, but that off centering will probably leave it a 9. And then I have an example here, a quarter finalist card from the 2016 Great Art. This is the starter year.
Oh, it's so cool.
Yeah. Uh,
How much are each of
it,
these cards like expected to go for, by the way?
so I would value the finalist card. If it gets a 9, prices are moving so much here, like everything else. But I wouldn't sell the card for less than at a 9, probably in the $3,000 range.
Wow.
If it gets a 10, it'll be the only one in the world.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so if it gets the 10, I'd probably want double that. probably for it. But I also think that card will increase in value probably. I think these cards are generally a good investment right now, although they're becoming less of a good investment because everything is going up right now. But still, as far as investments go, they're good. But going back to the topic at hand, yeah. So this other one, there is more whitening, probably very difficult to see here.
You want to hold it up a little bit closer? And so we're looking for white on the edges.
On the edges, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's honestly, it's very faint whitening, but this will probably be more in the 8 to 9 category because of that whitening. The centering is actually better on this card. So the centering would have been a 10 on this card. It's very likely, but because of that whitening, you're probably looking more into the 8 to 9. So that's how you're basically judging the differences between 10s, 9s, 8s. And to your point, not a huge difference, particularly if you're not someone who's focusing in and looking for very specific chipping and a little bits of white and the centering. And so to your question, and we talked about this off camera too, but you don't understand the value, of why people are paying so much more for that 10, or you're not sure that people should be, because they look really similar.
I'm curious how much more is more. So you mentioned that you would want to sell it for at least twice as much if it was a 10 versus a 9. Is 2x like the typical spread between the two?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it goes back to something we talked about in our last video, which is looking at relationships and trying to find value in relationships. And so when you're thinking of, should I buy this in 9? Should I buy this in 10? What is the better value at 9 or at 10? Looking at that relationship can be great. So I would value that card, at this specific card, at about double. And here's why. So it's the only 10, which makes it quite a bit more valuable in my mind. If there were more 10s, then I wouldn't value it quite as much. For me personally, trophy cards are so rare anyway that
trophy cards are these championship ones that they give out.
Yeah, these types of trophy cards are cards that they're just like, less than 50, ever printed with that that specific stamp. This is probably 12 or so, maybe 24, depending on the year. The having that card, I think, is so great that the condition criteria doesn't matter as much. Whereas there are so many, every set card, there's so many of every set card, including the first edition set cards that were printed, that having that PSA 10 is kind of that what really differentiates it from the other set cards. And so collectors are looking for that excitement, that chase, the fun of having that rare thing that other people may not have, the best of that Charizard, the best of that Lugia, and that rarity feeling.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to get a PSA 10 version of these cards that I showed in order to have some of that rarity feeling anyway. So I think that's why I wouldn't price it so much more, but I would lean in that double area because it's the only 10. Whereas there are set cards that if you look at the population, like particularly cards that have very low PSA 10, we looked at some of those in previous videos. For example, the Blissey comes up to mind in Neo Rev. There are only 10 of those in the world when we look that up. So, and there are a lot of, in those sets, there are a lot of cards that are only 25, there are only 30, there are only 15, there are only 9, 8 across those Neo sets and other sets. 2,000s of those cards in the world that are of all different PSA graded, quality, that's where the premium really comes in. That's where people are really willing to, well, I just want a PSA 10 completed set. It's my goal as a collector, and there are only 10 of those, so I need to pay that top dollar amount for that 10, because that 10 differentiation between the 10 and the 9 really matters to me. And because there are so many more 9s that getting a 9 isn't that difficult or that exciting. Getting a 10 is very exciting. And so I think that's where people are coming from, where people are feeling, how people feel about it, at least how I feel about it. But everyone has
I think it goes back to that there are different like psychographic profiles of collectors. And so they're the people who are like the really high-end collectors, like you, like want the best of something or the most unique or like the only, and there are other people who are just like, like me, right? Like I like certain Pokemon. I want one of those cards. I sort of want it to be nice condition, but I don't care that much. I guess what
Yeah.
I'm curious about is you talked about the relationships. And so I assume that if I saw like a card where the PSA 10 is like only 2% more expensive than the PSA 9, like that's a no brainer. I should go for that. Versus if the PSA 10 were like 20 times as much, I shouldn't. But like within that wide range, what would be a price differential where you're like, okay, the PSA 10 is like absolutely worth it?
So it all goes. So there are so many factors here, and what I was touching on before was that when I'm figuring out is the 9 the better buy or the 10. So they're two separate things. One is the collector mentality of like, I really love this card, and so I want it in the 10 for myself, right? And I don't care how much it costs. I'm going to pay what it costs, or I'm going to pay a little bit more than I normally would because that's I don't think it's going to come down from this price, or I think this price is okay. Then the investor side, which is like the side, I'm going to hold these cards for maybe 10, 20 years or something, or 5 years. And I want to see that card go up in value, and I want to buy doubles or triples of that card and then sell some of them at a profit, maybe to then reinvest that money into cards that I prefer or that I love or these sorts of things, versus the flipper who's just looking for like the best deal right now. So they're looking for like, what, oh, this price is priced $100 under what it sold for yesterday. I'm going to quick grab that card. I'm going to flip it for that higher price. Someone didn't taking advantage of people not understanding how much the current market is in flipping.
Mm-hmm.
So if we talk about the investor for a second, which I think is your question,
Mm-hmm.
what is going to make me the most money in terms of buying a 10 or a 9?
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of instances where I have bought 9s, and I bought a lot of 9s over the past couple years because my feeling, if you looked like a few months ago, the 9s to me had a much better value and a much lower risk side than buying the 10s. And so even though you've seen the 10s and the 9s both go up, in fact, in a lot of cases, very similar amounts, the 9s in many cases have actually been a better investment or a similarly as good investment with a lower downside. And what I mean by that is I was buying a lot of these cards for $40, $25. And so
Like,
you're
we say
getting
these cards. What are some examples?
Sorry, yeah, please. So a lot of the Neo cards I was going for, the Neo Hollows, some Jungle, some Fossil, some Gym Challenge, Gym Hero. Basically, whenever I saw them come up for what I viewed as like decent value.
You
So
said you told me that you
mostly,
got that Houndoom from Neo Revelations first edition PSA 9 for like $40 or something.
yeah, for $40. So I got a lot of cards.
Yeah,
In
and
that
now it's
Neo.
going for like 300.
Yeah, I got a Lugia, from that Neo Genesis set first edition for like $100, and now I'm not even sure how much it's going for. Like a lot.
I think it's over
The price
1,000. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the PSA 10 is like 10,000, or something
Right.
like those, a huge amount of money that. So I bought the Ho. I bought a lot of those PSA 9 first editions for those smaller prices. Now, interestingly, a lot of the more popular Pokemon, I do have less of some of those because those ones actually were always selling at that higher price point. So a lot of the less popular ones that had lower PSA 10 ratios, like Yanma is a good example from one of those sets.
Just because nobody cares about it.
A lot of these cards, but there were less than like 20 and 10. And so now those cards are going for like $200, $250. And they were going for like $25, $30 in PSA 9. So they've had these huge movements because people want to complete the set and they can't get that PSA 10.
Do you think that's because it's like hard to get the PSA 10 because that card specifically was like in a weird place in the sheet? Or is it just like people never thought to get that card graded because it's not like a cool looking Pokemon?
It's really the first of those two. It's that, because if you look at the pop cards, yes, the more popular Pokemon have more graded generally and have older grading, because not just because it was more popular, but that popularity then moved to value. So when Pokemon cards were a lot less expensive, it didn't make sense to grade a lot of the Hollows, and that's why a lot of them didn't get graded, because they weren't even valued that much more than the cost of the grading itself, for example. But yeah, so and it goes back to something I talked about in the previous video too, this idea that I'm only putting $25 into this card. The risk of it going down and me losing half that money is almost nothing, because we're talking about the cost of grading. We're talking about the cost of opening a pack. to find that PSA 9 hollow. So you have 1 in 3 chance of pulling the hollow. There are 16 hollows in the pack, right? So you have 18, you have 48, right? 1 in like 48 packs, you're going to pull that card. So you're going to spend, to get that card, you're spending $10,000 to get it, or, you know, something just insane if you really want that specific card. And in order to complete the set, you need that card. So we're talking a silly ratio between the amount it costs to get that exact card from a pack, if you really want that card to complete a set, whatever, and the amount it costs to buy this PSA 9 for $25. And at the same time, they were selling raw versions for more. People were buying
raw, meaning ungraded.
Ungraded. So there was a lot of weirdness in the market.
How long ago was this?
Maybe like a year and a half ago. More like a year and a half ago. So honestly, the Pokemon market has gotten quite a bit smarter.
More efficient, right? Efficient market.
More efficient. I think there are more people who are getting more experience. I think although now you may have a lot of new people in the hobby right now who are going to have some of that inexperience, which is part of why you might be seeing huge prices on certain cards that don't make that much sense, where they're better value. So like this card goes up $2,000, but this card only goes up $1,000, even though they have the exact same population and the exact same popularity. And when you see those types of things, then you're talking about hype.
So I guess to summarize, right, like when you're looking at relationships, you're looking at the price differential between 9 and 10, but also the difference in population between the two. Are there a lot more 9s and 10s? Could there be a reason for that, whether it's printing reason or people choosing to grade it reason, printing being more common? And then what are the cards that some people like? The pops are low, and so you should just get it because people at some point are going to need it to complete their collections.
Yeah.
And speaking of efficient market, I don't know if you've heard the joke about the efficient market hypothesis, that there are 2 economists walking down the road, and one of them looks at the ground and say, oh, look, there's a $20 bill on the ground. And the other one says, that's impossible. If it were really $20, someone would have grabbed it already. So I guess the equivalent in Pokemon is like you see like a raw card on the ground, you're like, oh my gosh, that card looks like it's totally gradable. And the other person's like, if that were gradable, it would have been sent in already.
Yeah, I think the reality is there tends to be a lot of fear in life. And that fear, the first people who started buying Pokemon cards when they were extremely cheap. You know, I came in much later once it was already established. But those first people who were like, these are going to be really, either I really love these and I want to collect them, but the people who are like, these are going to be very valuable. I see comparisons here to other markets. I see how popular, I see how people are responding to these things. I see a lot of value in here. There's a ton of risk in that because there isn't the established market like there is now, as much of an established market. There's still a lot of risk now because it's still very new. But to go to your point, it's like someone could just be like, well, it's never going to go up, or it would have already, you know, or whatever, or it's if it were more valuable, it would be, you know, these sorts of ideas. So I think that it takes time for people to be aware of value. It takes people explaining the value that kind of is like, oh yeah, I do feel that way about it. And it gets people on. Now you have organic hype, I would say, and inorganic hype. And I would say organic hype is sort of like you're getting more eyes. You have people making good arguments, and you have people, and those arguments are becoming more and more present, and people are seeing them more and more on YouTube or other places. So someone hears that good argument, they say, oh, I do really like this. I do see the price range. This does make sense to invest in. You have more and more people coming in. That raises the price of everything. The inorganic hype is the flipper saying my reverse hollow, you know, unbroken common in PSA 10 is worth $200, and types that on Twitter and then says, well, it's worth $200 because it's cool and like I like it, or what, you know, whatever, you know, even though that card is mass produced and all these sorts of things. And so you can, if you push things a lot and you get other people to kind of fake push it, you can convince people, I think, sometimes that something has a value that it really doesn't make sense. And I think you might see that in some, temporarily, exactly. Right. And so I think that eventually those things don't do as well in the long term in particular. So I would always suggest that people use logic, and if they're disagreeing, if they're feeling like this doesn't make sense, or I'm being sold something, or I'm being pushed something, to think for themselves and make decisions for themselves. But yeah, part of why we're making this channel hopefully is to like provide opinions that make sense that people then can think about for themselves and make their own sort of like wise decisions and compare it to other people's opinions and these sorts of things instead
Right.
of pushing specific cards to make money.
Unless we're all playing 4D chess and we're pushing the cards by making you think that you're thinking for yourself that it's a good
Well,
buy. We've dropped the name of that Blissey multiple times in the past couple of
yeah,
sessions. So
yeah, yeah. And I have all 10, by the way. I have none. I own 0.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jake. This was great. We'll do another one soon.
Okay, sounds good. Good talking to you.
You too.